So yeah, I wouldn't rank their military very high. It would be like throwing a bunch of darts at a dartboard and seeing what sticks, compared to, like, for instance, South Korea's reserve force, where they have to go on training and on a regular basis. 안녕하세요. 제 이름은 존슨그라프입니다. 미국에서 왔습니다. And I was stationed at Osan Air Base while I was in the military for about 10 years. Very good. 되게 멋있어요. Especially because it was the Air Force. So South Korean Air Force are pretty badass. Also, South Korean Marines were pretty cool too. But I've worked with South Korean Air Force the most. And I was always impressed with, even though they're conscripts, which I'm not a big fan of conscription, they're very strong national pride and honor in their work. So I admire that a lot. There were a few actual Marines that were there, and they had the same kind of fervor that our Marines had. I don't know if it was carryover or like because they trained alongside them. There was a lot of similarities that I could draw between our US Marine Corps and the Iraq Marine Corps. Very strong, very independent, and yeah, good fighting force. Obviously, this is a very complex geopolitical situation in Ukraine right now with Russia. The way I understand it is Russia attacked Ukraine for various reasons. Ukraine is doing what they can to try to fight back the Russian forces. Maybe. I'm not sure if Russia really would be considered second. Well, okay, if you can take in consideration their nuclear arsenal, then yeah. Really, it's the United States and Russia. But if it wasn't for the nuclear arsenal that Russia had, I don't think that they would be second. I think, honestly, it could be South Korea, or it could be Japan. Japan's defense force even could be stronger than Russia. But yeah, because of the nuclear capability that Russia has, it makes them a formidable opponent, I guess you could say. The nuclear weapons aspect makes things extremely complicated, because the use of tactical nukes is always a possibility. It complicates things a great deal if those were to be utilized. Right now, it's just a ground war, as far as I know. Yeah, let's hope that it doesn't get to that point. Probably towards one low, not jail, but very, very low. Simply because it's a conscription force. It's severely underfunded, despite the fact that they pour so much money into it, and it has a lot to do with the corruption. Money is just kind of squandered and stuff by lower level commanders that was supposed to go towards like maintaining their APCs and their tanks and these kinds of things. And that really only came to light until they started the war, because you see a lot of these armored vehicles and things just like on the side of the road with their tires completely blown out and stuff. It's because they weren't properly maintained, right? So the likelihood of that money just basically being squandered away or stolen by lower level commanders was very high. So yeah, I wouldn't rank their military very high, or nearly as high as I think I would have if the war hadn't broken out in Ukraine. 예비군 reserve forces, Korea has, I think, 3 million. Having a large reserve means that a lot of people that you can just call up on an instant like that and throw them into combat. But the significance, I think, about having a big reserve is whether they're trained. So it's not only that Korea has a huge reserve force of like 3 million soldiers, it's that they're certainly better trained than even like Russia being second, having as much as they do. I just don't think that Russia puts the kind of training that Korea puts into their soldiers. So yeah, even though they have a huge reserve force, it would be like throwing a bunch of darts at a dartboard and seeing what sticks, compared to, like, for instance, South Korea's reserve force, where they have to go on training and on a regular basis. Much like our reserve force in the United States, they're a fighting force. Global fighting power. I think it really just comes down to whether they're considering the nuclear arsenal of Russia. Because I think between the United States and Russia, there are about 13,000 nukes, something like that. Russia has about 5,000 or 6,000. We have about 5,000 or 6,000. I think Russia maintains something like 1,000 to 2,000, like ready to go. Ready for launch and stuff. That's a lot. I mean, granted, it's a huge reduction from what it was, like in the Cold War era, where there was just so much more and stuff. But still, having thousands of nukes ready probably is what's bumping that number up. They do have a pretty huge ground force, decent tanks, and a somewhat decent air force, and a really good air defense. But I think that's probably overinflated. I think it's inflated. China, on the other hand, I could see probably China being around there. I think that their biggest lacking in capability would probably be lack of navy, so their aircraft carriers, because I don't think they have any. Aircraft carriers make a big difference, which is why we have so many of them. A lot of these countries, they spend a great deal of their GDP on military, so that maybe has a lot to do with it. Purchasing weapons and training forces and stuff like that, it has a lot to do with how much money they pour into it. Yeah. I think so. The F-35 has been in development since like 2001. I think the KF-21's development started in like 2015. It's a decent looking aircraft. It costs a fraction of what the F-35 cost. South Korea says it's the 4.5 generation aircraft, which means it's kind of between the 4th generation and the 5th generation, which is basically a reflection of its stealth capabilities. It's a little bit less stealthy than the F-35, and then I think that has to do with the fact that it has hard points on the exterior, whereas the F-35 has all of its hard points on the interior. And then I think also it's like sensor suite, and I think over its entire life it costs somewhere around $1.5 trillion. They're supposed to start flight testing it, I think, this year in June or July, something like that. So we'll see. I mean, they're extremely more cost effective than the F-35, so I'm sure other nations like Indonesia and stuff will like to pick them up just to, combat the growing threat of China, and also maybe even Iraq and, other, smaller countries that don't have access to 4th generational airframes. Approachability to the KF-21 will be a lot easier on them. That's about what I know about that. I'm not really sure what the air arsenal crane looks like right now. I know that they had a few MiG-29s, but I'm not sure if they're up there anymore. And I know that the only reason that the Air Force of Russia hasn't made it into Ukraine is because of their extensive air defense. If South Korea were to offer any kind of support to Ukraine, I think it would be in the form of, well, maybe some kind of weaponry. I'm not sure what they can provide comparable to like what the U.S. is providing in the form of javelins and other anti-tank sort of weaponry. Maybe like food resources and maybe some personnel like in the back or something like that. I don't know. They don't have the same commitments that NATO has, so maybe they're a little bit more versatile and stuff, but I'm not sure how much South Korea would want to necessarily help Ukraine. But it's entirely up to its people, for sure. But I mean, I think Russia's pretty much already lost at this point. And it's more of a de-escalation scenario because nobody wants to escalate this situation any more than it already has. And we certainly don't want to back Putin into a corner. And then we run the risk of worse things happening. It's going to be a balance. This is why geopolitics is so difficult, because you run the risk of when you're helping any side of escalating the situation, right? But at the same time, you want to present, helpful mentality, right? Because I mean, the current view of the situation is that Russia bad, Ukraine good, right? But it's significantly more complicated than that. I'm not saying that wouldn't be the conclusion that you would draw after taking everything into consideration and stuff, but we have to understand that geopolitics is incredibly complicated and there are a lot of factors to consider. So making a move needs to be calculated and responsible. Any move, doesn't matter what it is. So today we talked about the South Korean military, more specifically about the South Korean Air Force. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. 본 적 있는 것 같은데 먹어본 적이 없어요.